on this topic. So with that, I will turn the webinar over to Tony, Dr. Tony Byers, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, Tony. So thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Holly. I so much appreciate the opportunity to connect with this community. It's nice to be in a place where you can feel like you're amongst your group, your people, your comrades. So it's nice to have friendly audiences. I'm assuming that this will be a friendly audience, but it's nice to have people kind of in the industry, committed to the work, thinking about ways in which we can improve and do it better. So I'm humbled by the opportunity. I'm thankful for you for reaching out and asking. I'm always surprised when individuals or organizations reach out. That's what you want, that's what you strive for, but when it happens, it's a humbling experience. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I thought I would, thank you. I thought I would just start out with a few slides. Maybe we'll go to the next slide, the introduction slide, just so you can see that, and that can set up as we talk. But as questions come up, I can see the chat function on the side. So I do see some of the individuals who did their sound check by chatting. And so if you have a question, feel free to chat those questions on the side as we're moving along. There's sometimes that I might move faster than I would like to, and so maybe I might not do a good job explaining a particular point. So if I need to clarify, or if you have a question, or even if you'd like to challenge some things that I mentioned, I welcome that. Also, I'm comfortable with verbal interruption too. I know we look like we're at about 20-something people, but if you can also just ring in and just say, hey, Tony, what about, or could you explain something a little further? And I'm happy to do that as well. And finally, I will leave some time closer to the end of the segment where we can ask some deeper questions or maybe have a little bit of dialogue back and forth. So we're scheduled for about an hour. My goal is to try to leave a good 15 minutes to have some conversation back and forth. And then we'll turn it back over to you, Holly, and then we'll take it from there.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm excited. Let me start out by telling you an experience that I had before I get into my background and all this other stuff. I'm sitting with a CEO of a large global organization. They happen to have several 100,000 employees. No, it's not Starbucks, but I always like to say that. But I'm sitting with that CEO. I was asked to come and talk to this organization about diversity and inclusion, and we were looking at developing a strategy for them that could help them be successful in the space. As part of the process, I have scheduled interviews with the CEO, who happened to be a male at this point in time, and his direct report. So there were 6 people that I was going to meet with, from the CFO, COO, all of those fun individuals. So I made it through half of the interviews, and it was time for me to sit with the CEO. I'm sitting with the CEO, we're sitting knee to knee, and we're having a conversation about general small talk, and then it was time for us to get into the diversity and inclusion subject. So right before I was getting ready to do my spiel, he looks at me and he says, so Tony, why don't you tell me something about D&I that I don't already know? And he had a really, really serious tone. His tone had changed from a very casual conversation we were having to this really deep, what I call CEO mode. He was actually in CEO mode. And immediately what it did for me is it switched my thinking to turn me into how to respond to CEO mode. So I was prepared to respond to this individual. So I had, my facts, and I know a little bit of data. I could tell you all this stuff about D&I, usually at the drop of a hat. And I made it about 2 sentences when he said, stop, Tony, stop right there. And he said, get up, I'd like to show you something. So we stand up. He proceeds to walk me around his office. We go to the commons area where people are having coffee, snacks, and meetings, impromptu meetings, or even formal meetings. And he's walking around, and as we're walking, he stops me and he says, stop, Tony. Do you see those group of people over there? And he's pointing over to the left. He said, do you see them? I said, yes. He looks at me and he says, they're African American. And I said, okay, no problem. And then we started walking. We took a few more steps, and he stops me. And he said, you see those 3 people over there? I said, yes. He said, they're women. And then that's when it hit me. I said, oh, we're doing this. He's going to show me, you know, the differences who he has inside of his organization. And he did it once with another group of individuals who happened to be from outside of the U.S. And then we went back to his office and he sat down, needed me with me, and he looked at me and he says, now, Tony, tell me something about diversity and inclusion that I do not know. Now, mind you, this is a very uncomfortable situation for a practitioner to be in, because what I quickly discovered is that for this leader, this subject has been all about having individuals who look different inside of his organization, having what he would consider to be diversity. And at that point in time, I discovered that the way that we have talked about diversity, or the way that the subject has come about for practitioners, is that we have structured the conversation to be about how do you obtain one more of X. And we haven't done a good enough job to help organizations and individuals understand what to do once you have X, and then how to leverage the power of X so that it can be much more effective. And so that led me on this journey to start to think about how I can improve the work we do in diversity and inclusion, so that one, it can have a long-lasting impact, but two, so that it could be different than where it's been in the past. And I'm one of those people who talk about diversity and inclusion and say, as an industry, corporate kind of subject or study, we've been doing this since, you know, the late 60s. You know, it's over 50 plus years old as a subject. And we're talking about the same subjects today than we were 50 years ago. And to me, that's a problem. So we have to figure out what we can do different as practitioners, how we can make a better difference inside of our organization, so that when we communicate and when we do our work, the organizations change, our society changes, people who we're working with change, and everything moves forward from there. And so that gives you a little bit of sense of what I'm motivated by. What I'm motivated by is how can we get better in this particular subject, and how can we as a group begin to have a larger impact, so that we're talking about things that matter and that we're creating change. And so that's how I like to start this story, or this introduction of myself, is to say I am a committed person to this subject. I've been in the D&I space for about 25 years. You'll see, if you can see the slide, at the top right, there's a funny looking picture of a person who looks like me. I guess that is me. And that's me. So you can see who's talking to you. And around there, I just put a collage of things to give you a little bit of my experiences. It ranges. It ranges from being inside of educational institutions, taught as an adjunct faculty member on the subject of diversity, leadership, management, organizational change at some universities in the Midwest when I lived in Minneapolis. As you heard Holly mention, that we worked together at Cargill, which was a fascinating place. It's one of, as she mentioned, largest private organizations in the U.S., but it's really a global business. And working at Cargill, you get a sense of how large the organization is and how much influence they have when it comes to impacting the world regarding food. So Cargill is an agribusiness organization. From Cargill, I went to the H.J. Heinz Corporation, now called Kraft Heinz Organization, and had a chance to build a diversity function, a global function for them. As a legacy company of 150 years old at the time, they've never in the history of the organization had a diversity and inclusion function. And so working with their senior leaders, their board of directors, and other global leaders, we developed a function to help them be impactful. And then even moving to Starbucks from Heinz Corporation, which Starbucks was a fascinating opportunity to participate in an organization that had commitment to diversity and inclusion, but started to think about ways in which they could evolve their messaging and evolve the practice of it. And I left Starbucks last year, 2017. And at that point in time, get some feedback. Maybe people could place their phone on mute or something. That would help. There we go. At that time, when I was making the decision to depart, the CEO at the time, Howard Schultz, was making the decision that he was going to step down as CEO and move on to some other things. And that precipitated my desire to say, well, maybe I ought to think about what I want to do next. And one of the things that occurred to me is that I often receive calls about the importance of diversity and inclusion and how can we do this better and what are the processes that we should follow. And so from leaving Starbucks, I decided to take a break at Starbucks. They affectionately call it a coffee break, believe it or not. It's kind of like a sabbatical, but they call it a coffee break. And I took this coffee break to go write this book, which you see in the center of the screen. And that book was based on that experience of talking to that one CEO who helped me think about this differently and how could we start to think about behaviors of inclusion and what's necessary in order for diversity to work. And then in between there, I did a lot of consulting. And I do a lot of consulting right now, working with organizations and coaching other diversity leaders and speaking on the subject of diversity and inclusion. So I just wanted to give you kind of that background of how I've come to this point and why I would like to believe maybe Holly thought it would be good for us to have this conversation together. During this conversation, what you'll see is I try to give you a little bit of background about working as a practitioner. I give you some of my stories and experiences. And then I go into what does it mean to kind of be a practitioner. There's working as one and then there's being one. I will tell you, this is called strategies for success, but it's probably better stated as lessons learned. You know, what did I learn or what can be helpful? And then we'll end at that point where we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So why don't we start with the first one? Next slide, please. Working as a diversity practitioner is really fascinating. And if you could see that image on the top left, that's what it feels like. It feels like you are pushing a rock up the hill. It is challenging, and it creates really a lot of frustrating moments for diversity leaders or people who are serious about the subject. And part of the reason why it's so challenging is because for many, it can be an emotional subject. It can be a hard subject to get to some of the measures out. It could be a hard subject to convince the organization that it's of value. We're going backwards. We'll go forward one more time. And it can also be just one of those subjects that just create a lot of ambiguity for leaders in the organization. But I've noticed some trends in the space from talking and working with leaders, and I thought this would be interesting to share with people. There is new energy around diversity and inclusion. We're starting to see organizations get really, really serious about the subject, and they're coming back to the table and they're asking themselves, in part, what can we do to get better in this space? I think they're recognizing that they have been engaged in the subject for quite a long time, and they're asking some deeper questions about what's necessary in order for us to be better. Part of it is driven by the consumer. The end user is demanding that organizations start to actually show and live their values more. And you're seeing a lot more organizations responding to that. You see a lot of organizations, I'm just pick one, like Apple, for example, who are speaking out about their values in terms of supporting differences, supporting immigrants, supporting diversity and inclusion, how important it is, because their consumers are talking about it. And then you also point to what's happening in our country at a larger level. There's just a lot of dialogue about individuals who come from different backgrounds, different perspectives, how we work together, and why diversity is important. And there's a lot of energy around that in a lot of corporate organizations right now. The other thing that I'm seeing, or we have seen as a trend, is that the brain research of bias. And I'm sure all of you heard about unconscious bias training sessions. They're high off the press. Just about everybody is doing it right now. And this whole thing about making it easier for individuals to understand that they're biased is creating an opportunity to have conversations about what they can do different. Now, what's fascinating about bias or brain research is that now that we have people talking a lot about, oh, I have a bias or unconscious bias, and these things have become clever and actually in some cases very interesting, the most fascinating part about the research is that when people receive training on bias, they are more likely to recognize biases in other people than themselves. And so there's an opportunity for us to really think about how that mirror comes back around and make sure that we give people an opportunity to think about what are my biases and how can we express them. one big thing that we see, or that I have seen, is that just about every organization that I worked with in the past 12 months, all of them have said, we feel like we've had good awareness. You know, you might hear, we want Bias 2.0 because we had an awareness of bias. You know, you might hear, we've done a lot of different trainings. And you also have this understanding that people are trying to figure out what to do. As I told a group once before, I've never met a leader, senior leader or otherwise, who has said that they're not interested in diversity and inclusion, or better yet, that they don't care about it. Never met one who says, I don't care. But every single one that I've met still becomes challenged when you ask them, what does it mean to do diversity? They're all for it initially, but they struggle with but I don't know what to do. So you sit with leaders and you say, yeah, I'm for it, Tony, I'm supportive of it, but tell me what you want me to do. And for many, that can be a challenging aspect, because how do you tell somebody to do diversity? There is the notion of, you can tell somebody how to do inclusion. You can tell someone how to practice certain behaviors, but still there seems to be a struggle with, how do I apply this stuff? And how do I make sure that I'm living it every day? Now, I'm checking the side, so if questions come up, you can feel free to type them in or say something verbally. But until then, until I hear something, I'll just keep going. There is this also expanded definition of diversity and inclusion. We're starting to see now a much broader conversation about D&I, what it means, who's involved in it, everything from social to economic to individuals from different parts of the world. These subjects and topics have been normal for diversity practitioners, but for organizations, they're starting to really try to understand how to make that work inside of their environment. And then the last two things is innovation and values. How do you get to the point where they're pulling diversity and inclusion through so that it starts to have an impact on products and services that organizations provide? And that's really what a lot of leaders want to know. If you think about 3 stages of D&I, one of the things that we discover is that individuals focus on the workforce, and that's a big part of what they're trying to do. And then there is this thing about the workplace, where they're thinking about what's my environment looks like and how can I create an environment that values the subject. And then this last one is about the marketplace. And they're spending a lot of time thinking about, how do we get to the marketplace with diversity and inclusion? And when you talk with a lot of leaders, the very first thing that they want to do is they want to start with marketplace. But it's like building a pyramid from the top down. We have to get to that point of, how do we make sure that we have these foundational things in place so that we can pull through to the marketplace? So we see a lot of that.
And Tony, you do have a couple of comments that you might want to address?
Question. Yeah, I'm looking at that now. So the rock becomes easier to push with ongoing training and as a team, doesn't it? Sometimes. What we are discovering is that even those organizations that are well trained, they have the awareness, they're still struggling with some of the process challenges within inside of their environment. And then, so what happens is, once the effect of the training wears off, they feel like they're starting over or going backwards. So they're getting the awareness, but they haven't made much process changes inside of their organizations. And so it becomes a systems change type initiative. How or what are we doing to change the system so that we don't have the rock go backwards? I will admit that it's nice to have other people helping you with the rock, because, as you try to move that rock, it is challenging to do it by yourself. And once you move away, the rock goes backwards. You can usually have somebody hold it for you, or you can have a group of people, and this is maybe this group of people on the phone who can help us get the rock up the hill. But inside of organizations or institutions, we see a struggle of still making progress of getting that rock up the hill. So it's fascinating to see how that works. And so thank you, Patricia, for that comment. We can continue that dialogue too. And so, Jill, I see your point about getting several board members to understand the how in terms of measurement. What I hear today from others is they need to change board policy. Basically, I work with a lot of nonprofit boards, and a lot of some professional boards, organizational boards, for-profit boards. And we still keep coming back to, how do I just find one of X? And we haven't done anything to look at our processes, to examine how we make decisions, to examine other talent management processes that can actually make this thing become sustainable versus an initiative. And we're always striving for long-term sustainability versus trying to make sure that we have an initiative to gain more of X. And I think that's one of the big challenges that organizations are faced, or institutions are probably faced with, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. And to Darren's point, and HR policy. Yeah, so talent management processes, HR processes, and depending on whether we're talking about getting people from the outside into the organization, and or whether we're talking about the individuals we have within our organization, how do we move them through succession planning so that we see equal growth or access for all individuals with different backgrounds. Now, some call outs, just from what I know. As I mentioned, I've been in the subject or in the field a long time, and I can't stress enough how important self-care is. And I want to make sure that all of us are doing that. And this is probably intuitive, and many of you probably do a good job of it, but it's worth repeating. I was sitting at working or coaching one of a D&I leader for one of the largest retail organizations in the world. And that person, she was highly, highly stressed. And as I sat and talked with her, I kind of remember what that stress felt like. But it is hard work to do. I use the analogy all the time that if an organization was the body and each part of the organization had major functions, like maybe the executive team was the brain or the operations was the heart. And, again, this is just an analogy. If you look at the D&I function, they would actually be, as an organ, they're the liver. And it's not the most sexiest organ perhaps, but its function is to clean and filter things. And so what you do as a D&I person is you try to clean and filter things that happen inside of the organization and then replace it back into the system. So you have people who come to you and they talk about this. You have experiences. And sometimes as you're cleaning and filtering, you can keep some of that. So it's really important that we think about self-care. I know a lot of D&I leaders, unfortunately, who have had major, major problems with health. And my belief is because they're getting some of that toxicity, if you will, from being a practitioner and not finding ways to manage self-care. Inertia, we've been doing this for a long time, and I think it just seems to work. And people have been able to build nice businesses from it, and we see some starts and stops. How we apply this is becoming important. We need to have a switch to really start talking about behaviors and how we're holding people accountable to act differently versus to build their awareness. And the assumption that we make is that if we just inform people that what they're doing is wrong, that they will change. And what we now see is that actually not the case. So, it's always been, hey, just tell them that the way they're thinking is wrong, and they'll just come around to you. And so that kind of approach has not been successful inside of the D&I sphere. So there's a comment. Planning for context, succession planning and knowledge transfer is so important. Okay, comment. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's go to the next slide so we can talk a little bit about being a practitioner, some of my experiences and what I've learned. One of them is, this is more from the perspective of an internal, and many of you probably work with a lot of internal D&I leaders or other HR leaders who are responsible for moving initiatives inside of their organization. But man, it is a challenge to have to make changes inside of an organization when you don't have, I'm using air quotes here and I probably should have put it on the slide, when you don't have the power to actually make those decisions. And so when you're sitting down with leaders or leadership teams or functions and you are recommending certain things, you actually need those leaders to move forward and make it happen because they make the hiring decisions or because the employees report to them under their particular function, or your job or your role is to be an influencer in order to get things done. And I've learned that a lot from some of the organizations that I worked with. So I went to one leader who was the head of sales for North America for a particular company, and just sat down with him and started to talk about what we could do to impact the space around inclusion and diversity, and really had a powerful conversation to the point where I thought he was with it and he got it. But I said, you know, you could make this change A, you could make change B, either one of them will be good for you. And when I left, the leader, he didn't make any changes. And so that leader actually just spent a lot of time thinking about the process until the next opportunity we had to get together. And what I realized at that point in time is that all of these powerful things that we suggest, all of these opportunities or initiatives, that we actually don't make those decisions. So we really have to find a way to influence a leader, whether it be to help her understand how her business can be a benefit, or to help him understand how he might benefit. We have to find the right key to influence a leader to make the right decision. Part of that is based on what they're rewarded on, and the other part of that is based on how compelling our ability to influence a leader will be.
Tony? This is Holly. I'm with
Yes.
SIETAR USA, and I just want to comment from my own experience working in this space and reflecting what I've heard from a lot of people on this webinar and others is that is part of the element that makes the job stressful when it is that you have such limited impact, you work so hard, it's good work, but you can only control so much. So what have you found has been successful knowing you're only one piece of that puzzle? Still good work, but you can only control so much. Have you found particular strategies that helps, or just the self-care piece? I'm just interested in your own experience in that.
Absolutely. Well, self-care piece is, I never want to let that go, but the one strategy that I found to be effective, and it worked in a number of different organizations, is when you're working with senior leaders, is to recognize their competitive nature. And what I mean by that is that if you can find one senior leader advocate, one person who is willing to take some of your suggestions and implement that, I would take that one leader and I would blow that work out. I would take one functional leader, I'd talk to her as the leader, say, this is what we can do, here's how we can make some changes. And every time we made some progress, I made a big deal over it. Every time I talked to the senior leadership team, I shared them as the number one example. When I went to board meetings, I shared them as the number one example. And then what started to occur is that the other leaders, through their competitive nature, wanted to find out how can they get some of that additional recognition and praise. And so they started to approach me and say, hey, what is it that Holly's team is doing? How come we're not doing it? And what's fascinating about it is, you know, I talked to that one leader's team months before I found my role model leader. So find a role model, work that role model to death, hold them up in every meeting, every example, to the CEO, to the employees, to the board, and watch other leaders say, how can I get that recognition too? And I have found that to be a really good tactic inside of many different organizations.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I wonder if there's a more of a U.S. focus on that, but probably not. When you're at that level of senior leadership, that competition's often there. So that's a wonderful tip.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. And you know, it's worked great with global companies as well, global leadership teams, because what it is that they're all looking for ways to have the CEO see them as being a contributor in this factor. So when in this space, so when you're talking to the CEO or the board, and you're able to say, hey, I'm getting my diversity report, but before I do, I want to talk about the work that Holly's team is doing. They're getting recognition for the efforts. The board is praising, the CEO is praising, people want to see it. And so even if the competitive nature is not driven by the fact that they want to win, in air quotes, it's driven by the fact that they want to be seen as a person or a leader who cares about the subject, engaged in the subject, and is getting feedback that can help their leaders and their peers see them as a person who is making a difference. So there's some that just want to win, and then there are others that just want to be seen as I'm contributing to this space overall. And that's what I've noticed. Okay, one of the Other things that I've seen in this particular place, or other things that I've learned, is to really understand the business. I get it, talking to an experienced group of individuals, and you probably say this is the way you ever get that, but I can't overstress this point. Understand the business. How does this group make revenue? Or what is the number one driver for this group? And how does your D&I approach or strategy affect or impact that? When working with senior leaders, if they discover that you don't have a sense of how they make revenue, how they make money, or what's the most important thing, they will only go so far. And so I'm definitely one of those big persons, or individuals who say that it's really, really important to understand the business. And then go back to the values of the organization. Sometimes we suggest change, or I would suggest initiatives that I think that are important in order for D&I to be successful. And I would come in with a set of values. But then there are other times where I go into an organization and say, I just really want to ask you one question. What are the values of the organization? And do you have any values that reflect inclusion and diversity? And if you don't, then it's open for a question of whether or not you really value the subject. And so as organizations are starting to live their values more, and as organizations are starting to do whatever they can to demonstrate to their end users how important their values are, being able to link the subject to their values becomes a really, really important process. And I see a couple questions. I'll grab them in 1 second. Let me get these last 2 points. Demonstrating progress. And what I've also discovered is that leaders need to see a step-by-step progress. And depending on the environment, some want to see quarter by quarter, others need to see month by month, and some are comfortable with half a year or a year, but we really have to give them a detailed roadmaps with milestones and markers that they can visibly see to understand we make progress. Because if you don't, what ends up occurring is that the organization sees us, the D&I practitioner, as doing a bunch of activities, and they don't understand how a training or a workshop or a webinar or changing the process actually impacts the larger D&I strategy at the end of the day. Even though you start out telling them that, if they don't get a sense of where they are on the map, they get lost in the activity. And so I found it to be really, really important to make sure we hit that. And then finally, for this point, and then I'll get the questions, is make a clear distinction between diversity and inclusion. This one I had to learn because leaders, you ask 10 leaders, you get 7 different responses to what it means for diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that I try to make simple for individuals that I work with is that diversity is what we look like and inclusion is what you do. And so some people will use one term or the other as a catch-all, but when they start to try to measure it or talk about it, what they're really starting to unpack is workforce representation. And other companies have a good sense that, we could talk about diversity, one, building a diverse workforce, but what are we doing to build a culture? How do we leverage diversity so that we can be successful? Okay, so Meredith is asking about websites, journals, professionals that you would recommend that provide tactical implementation ideas and tips. And okay, trying everything in business is imperative. And then somebody found a nice blog. Jill, you found a nice blog, medium.com, which I am not aware of that one. So some of the organizations that are starting to do a little bit better job, there's professional organizations, and then there are some just kind of on the side. So professional organizations, some of you might be familiar with. One is SHRM. I do know they tried to revamp their diversity practice, and they've started, I've had conversations with them about the direction they're going in. SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, is starting to do some very interesting things in this space. The other is the Human Capital Institute, HCI. They've totally revamped their internal page, their internal workings to focus on diversity and inclusion, or for a focus on diversity and inclusion, is one of the categories that they have that they're starting to get more involved in. And I'm usually engaged in a number of their conferences, but they have some good resources that I've discovered on their website. The Association of Talent Development, ATD, the former AFTD, has started to revamp their internal site and have a great segment or section on diversity and inclusion. I actually participated on a webinar interview about the book, about my book here about 2 months ago in October, some period of time. And I had a chance to kind of thumb through some of the stuff that they had, which I found to be really interesting. You see some things from, if you're one of those individuals that like conferences or experiences, the Forum for Workplace Inclusion, you can see some good stuff on what certain leaders are doing in the space. In particular, if you work with various industries and you want to see different types of industries represented, that's a good place to go. In terms of books and authors, one of the better ones on measurement has always been Edward Hubbard, Hubbard. He does some really deep work on how to measure the impact of diversity and inclusion programs. He has one called the Diversity Scorecard. He's just one of those individuals who has carved out a niche on measuring diversity and how to measure the overall impact on diversity. And he has a website that has some templates, and some of his books are good. If you get one, you'll get a sense of how he's helping individuals understand how to tie it all together and measure the actual impact of a diversity and inclusion initiative. So those are, in addition to the ones that are listed on the screen here, those are some that come to mind, come to top of mind. And everyone will summarize these resources for you later. That's fantastic. Thanks, Tom. And also, Jill shared the City of Edmonton. Had a great document, which I will actually be curious to see myself. So I'll take a look at that. So thank you for sharing. Let's do this: strategies for success, and then the last slide we have will just be Q&A, so there'll be time for us to have more conversation. Here's what I found, and this is I know that all of you on the phone love the subject, but you have to have a demonstrative passion for the subject. If there's anything that I've learned when working with organizations and leaders, is that once they feel like that person really has a high level of passion for the subject, that their ability to influence those leadership teams increases. You could be an expert, you could be, have a lot of information, you could have done this a lot. But right now, what I've seen and what I'm starting to discover when I talk to other organizations, in particular, those who are calling me after they've worked or talked to other consultants or groups, is that they say they felt like the person didn't have a passion for the subject, and they really want to be inspired more around diversity and inclusion. And so they're looking for experts, but they're looking for inspirational experts that they want to bring into the organization, because as they describe it, we've been talking about the subject for a long time. So how do we reinvigorate and really get people to jump behind the subject and help us move forward? And so I hear a lot of people talking about that. Having a differentiator. What is yours? Are you a trainer? Are you a cultural expert? Are you an inclusion expert? Are you a diversity expert? Whatever yours is, be really clear about how you differentiate yourself from other types of D&I consultants that an organization talks with or that they interview for internal success. Really is important. For myself, I am seeing now, people will sometimes refer to me as a D&I expert but they're also starting to see me being in what some people call an inclusion strategist. And, I'm starting to talk about now that we have a lot of people focused on building diversity with various degrees of success. And so I'm going to let them do that. What I want to talk to you about is how do you leverage the diversity you have so that it can go towards business growth, or so that you can get innovation and solutions and better services and serve your clients more. And so really right now, a lot of my engagements, people are saying, we've heard the diversity, but we're really looking for some of those things that we can do different. Now, so I'm big on behaviors. I'm big on creating the environment. I'm big on utilization of differences versus having differences. And so, that's how I would describe my differentiator. And then what's your strategy for long-term impact? And it cannot be training, because training is important, but it is not going to get people through the long-term, making meaningful progress towards their overall initiative at the end of a period of time. What we're discovering, we see great examples of this with tech companies, and the tech companies 3 years ago started to look at their workforce profile, started to express how they were unhappy or dissatisfied with the numbers, then shared more publicly with what they were going to do to build more representation. They set a nice timeline, and even some of them created some fantastic online training that they shared with the larger community. And then you look up 12 months later, and they went from 2% of one particular group down to 1.8% of one particular group. So they've done all of the right initiatives, but they're moving backwards in terms of their direction. And that's because their strategy was built more on obtaining talent than it was to build long-term impact for cultural change inside of their environment. And so you see a big deal there. Make progress and steps. I think I kind of talked about that. It's how do you show leaders where you're going, how we're making progress, show them the steps, give them the roadmap, tell them this is where we're at. Remember, we talked about we were going to do this. This is where we're at, and if we keep moving down this journey, this is where we're going to end up. So really staging processes out. And awareness in education is not enough. You've heard me allude to that, is that, you can be aware of differences, but if you're not leveraging the differences, then you face high levels of turnover, dissatisfaction. You see no movement in senior leadership, and that's when you start to see the numbers of the representation numbers of an organization go backwards, because they spent time trying to obtain talent, but they didn't spend time trying to utilize or leverage the talent that they had. And as a result, they're not getting the benefits of having a diverse organization. You all know the research about diversity. Those organizations that do diversity and inclusion well outperform their peers by an average of 26% on the S&P market, 28% in the FTSE, 40% more likely to capture new markets. All kinds of data points are out there that we can look at and begin to think about. But you can't, what's misleading about that is that those research data points have people thinking that actually just having diversity is what is going to get them those benefits. And really the key is about how do you leverage diversity. So how do we get people to start behaving differently, not being aware that they are differences that they need to think about. And the last 2 points, and one is understand the D&I maturity of the organization. I wrote some article, whatever it was, that was titled, When Best Practices Lead You Down the Wrong Road. And we see a lot of organizations that really want to know, what are the best practices and what are people doing? And they want to start to incorporate those inside of their organization. And what they fail to acknowledge is that the organization X has been doing this for 10 years. So it's easy for them to kind of have this be their next initiative. And their organization that they work in just started, last year. And so you're going to try to do the same thing that an organization has been working on 10 years. So here's a side note on that. And this one is Starbucks Coffee Company. When I wasn't there when the Philadelphia incident occurred, I talked to a lot of individuals inside the organization when it was going on about how they should approach it, and received calls from a number of people across the country after the announcement was that they were going to do training for all of their employees inside of their corporate-owned stores across the U.S. And the question was what I thought of the process.
Hey, Tony,
And Tony,
can you give a quick overview of what the Philadelphia incident was, just in case not everybody's aware?
Just in case so sorry. Yes, I just made an assumption there. So the Philadelphia incident that impacted Starbucks was earlier this year. There were 2 gentlemen of African-American background who were sitting inside of a Starbucks store in Philadelphia waiting on a business colleague. And that business colleague was running behind. So the gentlemen were waiting. And during the process of waiting, one of them wanted to use the restroom, and the manager wouldn't allow that person to use the restroom. So they sat back down and waited. So eventually what happened is the store manager called the local police and said that these individuals were just hanging out. The local police arrived. The individuals tried to explain that they were waiting somebody. Manager said they were hanging out in the store, not really doing anything. Long story short, they got arrested. And someone caught it on video and saw these two gentlemen being walked out of the store. And it was a big outcry from a lot of members in the various communities that they were profiled, racially profiled. And so it was one of the responses. Starbucks decided that they were going to shut down all of their stores on U.S. Memorial Holiday weekend and send all of their employees through some type of awareness training. They call it a combination between bias and policy, et cetera, training. But it was a massive, massive effort to try to train everyone across the country at the same time. So I was contacted about what do I think of the response and how would I have done, what would I have done different if anything. And essentially what I tried to let people know is that Starbucks was at a point where that kind of training could actually have some impact. Because they've been talking about D&I for a while. They had a number of initiatives, other, trainings have occurred, regardless of what people thought of the training and its impact or if it was a good idea. They spent a large number of years actually thinking about this process. And so that type of training was okay and natural to do. For another organization that I spoke to, they said, we could never just start there. And you're absolutely right, because you might just now be starting out on diversity and inclusion and really starting to have it go through your business. But Starbucks has been on this journey for 10 years, 15 years. And so for them, that move is okay. And so really just understanding that life cycle or maturity level. And there is someone asked about this concept of maturity. There is a framework, and Holly, I'll have to get you the name of it, but I believe it was done by the conference board, if I'm not mistaken, and it is the diversity maturity framework, and it really just shows whether or not an organization is in the foundational stage of D&I, they are in more of a leverage stage. I believe there's 4 or 5 stages that starts at the basic, foundational, and I'm not getting the categories right, but the last one is leverage diversity. So based on the path of the organization and some of the initiatives that they've been involved in, you can kind of see where those organizations are at. And once you know where your level is, you can actually start to determine what are going to be the right initiatives that's going to have a better impact versus trying to emulate other organizations because, hey, they're cool, so let's do it. And then last one, how do we start to think about improving the culture so that they can perform better over time? And again, so much effort is spent, and it's not a judgment, but just so much effort is spent on just trying to gain differences within the organization. And not enough is spent on how do we improve the culture to leverage the differences that we have or that we will obtain once it arrives. And there just needs to be more time spent there. And so I'll stop at that point. And now this is an opportunity for us to be able to have deeper dialogue. Oh, here we go. Stacy. Yeah. I was with some Starbucks employees the other day, and some of the complaints so the question is, if you can't see it, I noticed a lot of complaints about Starbucks training on social media from people of color within the organization. Yeah. And, not everyone was satisfied with the training. In particular, one of the biggest feedback, negative feedback that they received, from what I understand, was that the training did not have an external facilitator. It was internally led. So they tried to create a guidebook and a video, and the store managers were to kind of lead their teams through the conversation. They were trying to build more capability there. And what a lot of people felt frustrated about was the fact that in many cases, the store manager could be the one that needs the training the most, but you're asking them to facilitate it, so they're not necessarily getting some of the benefits of it. So some people didn't, not everyone enjoyed or liked the training. And then there are others who thought it was informative, but now what are they going to do next? And so as a result, for example, Starbucks made some made some policy changes. Now they allow people to use the restroom, and they do some things differently with the hopes that they don't find themselves in that same situation. You know. And I see you found a different framework. Yeah, from Omera and Richard, they do good work on the D&I framework, and Patricia has coached two of the executives there. Fantastic. There. So that's my spiel. That's kind of like my introduction. What if you were to ask some questions or look for some guidance? What things could I share that you think I might be able to at least give you one piece of information that might help you? That might help you think about this differently, or help you find more information and be more effective.
Yeah, everyone, please feel free to unmute yourselves or chat in a question. We want to take full advantage of Tony's time. Tony, while we're waiting for some questions, why don't you share a little bit about your book? We'd love to hear, what was your angle for this particular, because the field, there's some great volumes out there. What are you trying to achieve with your book?
Thank you for that. So what I wanted to achieve was, and I may have mentioned this earlier, is I received a lot of calls while at Starbucks and other companies, and just people just kept asking, like, what are you doing? I'm a practitioner. What's working for you? How are you building a strategy? And I remember sitting with a number of other practitioners, and someone asked a question, somebody should just write this down. How come we don't just write this down? I think I said it. How come we don't just write this down, make it easier so people can just stop calling? So I don't know if the initiative was to try to get people to stop calling if they wanted to share best practices or what they felt were going to be effective practices. But it really was, how do I help practitioners do this better? And how do I help elevate the thinking around diversity and inclusion? Because so much of it has been, it's just varied. Some people are still focused on obtaining talent, and I really wanted to help leaders started to think about what it really meant to create an environment and a culture that's based on inclusion and how to get the benefits of that. So for me, what you'll find in this book is a little bit of background and story, but you'll also find what I identify as seven key behaviors for building an inclusive environment that I think leaders should practice. And if leaders practice those behaviors, they'll start to make steps towards creating an inclusive culture. I wanted to make the distinction that inclusion is actually the thing that drives innovation and growth in businesses. And as a business starts to think about where they're at on their life cycle, if you're really interested in growing and having different business results, that you can tap into diversity and by leveraging it through inclusion, and that came to different outcomes, then you will see the benefits of the research that is always talked about in terms of having diversity. And then I wanted to give individuals a framework and some questions to start to think about when they are building their own diversity strategy. It's one of the things as a consultant, I go in and think about a series of questions. And so I wanted to put that framework down in the book so people can do that themselves and think about ways in which they can start to ask some deeper questions around D&I inside of their environment. So that's what that was what that's about. Oh, my. Allison, can you recommend global D&I trainers who are experiential and participatory? Allison, I don't know if there's a particular area that you're looking for or interested in. For example, are you looking for someone to do training, on Byers? Or are you looking for them just to do general awareness training? Are you looking for them to do strategy training? Those kind of things would be different. I've seen different groups. I know like some of the groups from Cook Ross do a good job with some of the bias stuff that people seem to really gravitate towards. We started to see David Rock do a lot of good stuff on brain research and having models that people are starting to gravitate towards. I've seen other organizations like Korn Ferry. There used to be Global Innovations, but Global Innovations was recently, or about a year or two ago, bought by Korn Ferry. You can see them doing a really good job of engaging people, engaging organizations and leaders, doing some good things. So you see a lot of that. So and then Allison is asking, inclusion across international cultures. Yeah, we did touch on, I think I tried to, how do you foster? So there is, what is the name of this? I tested my memory here and I should have it in front of you. Some individuals who do a good job of really talking about culture, besides your organization, what is this guy? Or this woman by the name of Erin Meyer. She does some things on culture, the culture map that I've seen I've seen organizations gravitate towards and feel really good about. And then there is cultural. What is this guy's name? The CQ. Holly, you gotta help me. I'm trying to figure out this person's name, and I can't get it out of my head right now.
The culture quotient.
David Livermore.
Yes.
David Livermore. I'm starting to see a lot of organizations start to gravitate towards some of his work, in particular in international cultures. And then one more person, there's an individual that talks about building bridges. And that's not the name of the organization. There is one called Building Bridges. But he does a great work on international environments. And he gets to the point of how leaders, how the organization creates an environment, and he uses the analogy of bridge building across cultures. And it's based on some work that he's done in some remote villages across the world and some organizations that he has worked with. And when Chris Ernst, I believe his last name, Boundary Spanning Leadership, does some good things too inside that book. And they were a part of a training organization in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, that has done some great stuff to help international cultures or international organizations, mostly cultures, think about ways in which they could do some bridge building and coming together and build inclusive type environments.
And Tony, I'll just add that that question is a good piece of information for us for a potential future webinars, like who are the people doing the work in the field? What can we share? There's so many great resources, especially globally, not just like yourself and USD&I. And of course, your work spans, various contexts. So I just want to give a 1 minute, not a warning, but we have 1 minute left. So Tony, could you sum up anything you'd like to leave us with? And I'll just say thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We'll send a summary of this information to everyone, but I leave it to you, Tony, for a final word.
Thank you. And thanks to each one of you for participating with me and engaging with me. Someone made the point earlier that we can move the rock if we all do it together. And I do believe that in terms of our ability to build our capability. Sometimes we go back inside of our organizations or our clients that we work with, and we don't have that larger community with us to help us move that rock. So we have to really build the muscle together, and our ability to share and learn from one another and to challenge us to be better than where we were yesterday is the thing that is going to make D&I much more impactful in the near future. So I thank you for challenging me. I beg your pardon as I continue to challenge you, but just know that it's all about how do we get better together. So with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony, Dr. Tony Byers. We look forward to seeing your book, and I'll follow up with you afterwards. Okay? Everyone have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful.